we're going to talk about the working class struggle, and forces for progress.
All right. So as communists, we fundamentally seek to end the exploitation that's inherent in the capitalist system. Now, workers at any time, in any place, have always been compelled to resist against the exploitation that they face throughout history. This is hardly a new concept. We've seen not only the trade union movement throughout the 20th and 19th centuries, we've seen older movements such as Wat Tyler's rebellion against the nobility, or the practice of plebeian secessions, where ancient Roman workers would abandon the cities and let the nobles fend for themselves. Or my personal favorite, the oldest reported incidence of a labor strike in history, which happened 3,700 years ago in ancient Egypt over, and this is going to blow your mind, you're not going to believe this, unpaid wages. Wow. The more they stayed the same. Wow. Now to bring it back all the way from ancient Egypt to a situation that's a little more relevant to us, we look at the history of the United States and the working class and trade union movements in the United States. We see that when the working class is strong and militant and united amongst itself, that's when the most progress gets made. Now, but we've kind of got a little bit ahead of ourselves. We're all communists, okay? We know what the working class is. That doesn't really make it fair. Too much definition. But even today, we've seen now that as the situation created by the bubble of prosperity of the American post-war period continues to deteriorate, that working class action and militancy has steadily begun to rise as people begin to realize that the system isn't going to continue working for them. Now, this struggle most commonly takes place in the workplace over wages, hours, working conditions, but can sometimes extend out into other areas. Like,
It takes a minute to cycle. Let me see.
Yeah. Hours, benefits, working conditions, job security, hiring, firing, anything relevant to the working conditions and how they are weaponized against them for the interests of the capitalist class. You can get into a lot more nitty-gritty details on that, but this also includes just general outside of workplace organizing over what should the government prioritize? Should we build weapons to go bomb countries all over the world, or should we build housing and provide healthcare? You know, different classes are going to have different questions of these. They're going to have different answers to these important questions. The class struggle inescapable defines pretty much every aspect of not just American society, but of world society today as capitalism has grown and spread its tentacles all over the world. And working class people in all places all over the world are trying to struggle to improve their own lives through various means. And this is not just, this is in essence, it's self-defense. We didn't ask for any of this. We didn't want any of this. The capitalism was foisted upon us through the growth of the bourgeois class and through the enclosure movement, and now they use their power to wage violence against us, which we are compelled to resist. So the working class consists of all who draw their income from the products of their labor, those who sell their labor to the capitalists to make a wage. We've had the growing from the 19th century onwards, we had the phenomenon of proletarianization, where individual smallholder producers who owned their own property and their own tools and appropriated the products of their own labor were driven by the development of new technology out of business. They couldn't compete with the big industrial factories, and they were driven to abandon their holdings, sell them off, and go to the city, where despite being hundreds, if not thousands of times more productive than they were in their original state, they somehow find themselves poorer than they've ever been. This is because all of this productivity was not being distributed to the class that created it, but to the class of parasites that the private property system created and supported. And this process of proletarianization is continuing to this very day. Now, we have a very interesting situation in the United States, for the, shall we say, what's often called the developed capitalist world, the English-speaking world, Western Europe, South Korea, and Japan, where the highly anomalous conditions at the end of World War II produced a sort of bubble of prosperity that didn't eliminate, but put a serious dent in labor organization. It created a level of stability and prosperity that sort of defused the labor movement. And now we've seen, as time goes on, and the conditions that made that system possible have gone away, that all of this is starting to reemerge, and that trades that were once considered high-paying are slowly deteriorating, and profit has to be squeezed out from elsewhere as the rate of profit continues to fall. What we're seeing sort of I mentioned proletarianization, we're seeing a sort of neo-proletarianization where as corporate structures continue to grow, nominally independent individuals are being integrated into these corporate structures and becoming dependent on them to actually earn a wage, engaging in sort of neo-proletarianization process. So a great example of not just the working class in the abstract, but how these conditions have changed from the post-war period to today is in retail workers. Now, retail work used to be a relatively small industry, relatively speaking, compared to today. And sort of the beginnings of what can be considered the modern retail industry started cropping up as the consumer economy started growing once again in the aftermath of World War II. Now, originally retail work was considered it was looked down upon. It had its nose snubbed at. It was considered to be women's work. It was like, oh, you're a housewife. You've got nothing to do. You can get this part-time job in this retail industry and make a little bit of money for yourself on the side. This served a couple of major purposes. One, it routed around the existing structure of unions and made sure that this new industry built from the ground up would not have the same level of labor militancy. And two, it created a sort of cultural propaganda that the work was not worthy. It's women's work, it's lesser. It's supposed to be paid like crap because it doesn't matter. And this sort of segues into, I think, a salient point about the working class's task with regards to questions of racism and misogyny. Everyone has heard, not just among communists, but among liberals as well, and everywhere, I've heard about the scourges of racism and misogyny in our society. Now, it's not just as communists, we need to recognize not only are these things intrinsically evil in the abstract, but they also are obstacles to the formation of working class unity. And the early beginnings of retail work are a great example of this. People didn't look at retail work as being deserving of dignity because of misogyny, because it was women's work. It was a lesser industry that's meant to provide discretionary income to housewives who don't really matter and they should be dependent on their husbands anyway. That sort of stuff. And of course, racism was a huge obstacle for labor movements in the early 20th century. Many groups, many reactionary groups attempted to drive wedges of racism between the working class to prevent the formation of broader working class unity. And we as communists have the duty to fight these, to fight these phenomena, because having them in the first place is an obstacle to the formation of working class unity in the first place, which is the very basis upon which our acquisition of political power to advance the interests of the working class depends. In essence, fighting racism and misogyny are both represents a long-term strategic goal of the working class because it allows us to build unity from within. As communists, our duty is to bring forward leadership from within the working class so that they can acquire power through working class organization movements and exercise the power to advance their own interests. And of course, before we can do that, we need to build class consciousness. The ideas of the ideological poison on which the existing society rests, the sort of lies that we tell ourselves about how our society does and should function, need to be done away with. People need to understand who's exploiting them, how they're exploiting them, and what is to be done to fight it.
Can we ask, do the difference between strategy and tactics?
Oh, yes. The simplified putting it is tactics is about the battle and strategy is about the war. But yeah, that's in essence, it's little piece by piece. So tactics are for tools and for resolving individual cases, whereas strategy represents the overarching plan.
So now we're going to go to special oppression. So the program tries to seek to understand all the specially oppressed groups, like racially oppressed groups, nationally oppressed groups, women, LGBTQ, the youth. So that's what we're going to talk about. They often suffer like super exploitation. So like super exploitation, like racism. Racism, it serves two purposes. Number one, it justifies colonialism, slavery, exploitation. Well, they say in the program that the United States was built on racism. And really capitalism was built on racism because capitalism started from the enslavement of Africans and the genocide of the indigenous people. Like if you go to Marx, he talks about this with the primitive accumulation of capital. So like the cotton grown in the South went into the textile mills in the North and into England. So yeah, racism and capitalism go hand in hand. So yeah, racism justifies like colonialism, slavery, like racism in the United, or extra super exploitation in the United States, and colonial oppression and imperialist domination around the world. The program seeks to understand, like I said, how all of these groups are especially oppressed. This is like it's a lot of stuff. So we have to like communists, yeah, we have to fight against racism. We have to fight for the liberation of all these groups. But also, well, yeah, racism not only serves to justify colonial oppression, but it also divides the working class. So it gets like working class Europeans or white people to side with the capitalist class.
I'm gonna make a note on the dialectical point about this. We're talking about the, yeah, like the complexity and interconnection of these struggles. This is, it's the program, takes a dialectical approach to it. And I don't want to get too like into the weeds with like dialectical thinking, but it's about understanding like the relationship between the particular and the general, or the private and the common. I've heard it referred to that in different ways. But you can, when we start thinking about the struggles of especially oppressed groups and peoples and nations, that's like one way that like that helps me think about it, of thinking about it in the particular and the common. One thing that I know the program states is that there are struggles that these are whole peoples have like in common, and that it's also the duty of people who consider themselves communists, who, you know, to find ways to relate to that struggle.
So yeah, racism is one of the most important weapons the ruling class uses to weaken the unity within the working class itself and the relationship between the working class as a whole and nationally and racially oppressed peoples. So we must build multiracial unity with the struggle against racism and the fight for equality at its core. So in what ways do you think racism affects the unity of the working class? Okay, yeah, well, I'm thinking of Black Reconstruction in America, W.E.B. Du Bois, because he talks about the Black worker and the white worker, like the African who was enslaved, but then the white worker became like the overseer, and they wanted to be like the planter class. So like that's what capitalism does. It like creates a hierarchy of labor, and racism justifies like that super exploitation, killing and stealing land, and like, yeah, super exploitation, but also, yeah, they have a hierarchy. So the next people on the ladder up, I guess in America, white people, they want to be like the ruling class. So yeah, racism unites working class whites with the white capitalists or the capitalist class. Yeah, African Americans are a huge part of the working class. They were, yeah, brought to this country as enslaved people or as slaves. They fought against slavery. They fought to end slavery. Like, yeah, also in Black Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois talks about that was a general strike. They fought with the Northern Army, with the Union Army, and because of their efforts, the Union was able to defeat the South. But then fought against Jim Crow, segregation. There was Martin Luther King, and he led the fight against Jim Crow segregation, but then he evolved to fighting against capitalism, and he created the Poor People's Campaign. And then there was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which, yeah, they were fighting for voting rights in the South, but that evolved into the Black Power movement, which then led to the Black Panther Party. And today, like, it continues with fighting against police brutality and like the George Floyd protests or Black Lives Matter protests. Like, it's kind of cool because there's BLM, Black Liberation Movement, and then BLM, Black Lives Matter. But anyway, so it goes all the way up until today. They talk about the Poor People's Campaign going on today.
I was thinking of Vogue, right? That's came from ballroom culture, like Madonna. Yeah, right. Yeah. But you know, to add to that, think of the major hinge points in American history, the major historical turning points in American history here, right? You see the Black struggle is like freedom struggle is central at these moments, like major events in American history.
Yeah. So yeah, they face extra exploitation, oppression through voter suppression, criminalization and mass incarceration, police brutality, including murder, wage inequality, continued segregation, cultural domination. So yeah, racism, it gets extra profits for capitalism. But not only that, it takes on a life of its own. So well, we have to fight racism. I think like Huey P. Newton said, we have to fight racism and capitalism at the same time. Because even when we have socialism, there'll still be like the remnants of white supremacy left over. Mexican Americans are one of the largest nationally oppressed peoples in the US. They played an important part, very important part in US history, played a tremendous role in Texas and now exist in most major cities and small towns throughout the country.
The photos are a little, they don't come out as maybe as that big on the screen, but it does also somewhat symbolize a historical progression. If you've seen the first pictures, Emma Tinayuka of the Communist Party of Texas in the 1930s. And I think most people familiar with her here. And what was she doing in San Antonio in that picture? Yeah, the Mexican American consulate. And you know, this is at a time of talking about language, right? Of a language test to vote, right? So this is a population at that time that was, you know, had really no political rights in Texas. And even today, you still voter suppression. Who does that fall on disproportionately in Texas? Something to think about. And then also Salt of the Earth, I think is a film. I think that takes place in New Mexico. But I think that picture from the bottom left is from Houston.
So yeah, Puerto Ricans. So it's the second largest Spanish speaking population in the US, concentrated in New York mainly, but they're all throughout the United States. They're a historically constituted Colombian community. The features of the Puerto Rican people in the US cannot be completely understood without taking into account that Puerto Rico is a US colonial possession. Puerto Rico is a colonial possession of the United States, so which has forced many Puerto Ricans to move to the United States.
The question, like, what forms of exploitation, oppression, like, you see the pictures of these large protests on the upper left there. You know, when that took place, there was a hurricane, right?
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to note about the Puerto Ricans is if you look at Stalin's criteria for nationality, they actually stand pretty solidly as a nation, you know, in the sense that there actually is a territory, colony that it is, associated with them. And so certainly they've got a different status, but their exploitation is a lot more subtle. Their commonwealth has been completely ripped apart by private corporations with the full cooperation and encouragement of the US government. They have to accept you know, the poisoning of their lands by the US military, you know, for target practice and stuff like that. I mean, they are definitely different. They are not Mexicanos, you know, in the sense, in essence, whether Mexican American or Mexican. But it's a fascinating struggle that they have. And in fact, you know, they're split down the middle, whether they want to be a state or whether they want to be you know, their own commonwealth. And we as a party need to stay out of it. You know, we need to make sure that they are given full a reign to make their own choice and get reparations.
Okay, Native people, or the national struggles of Native people vary. Well, yeah, I mean, the United States is a settler colony. They stole the land from the Native Americans. So let's see. So here are some of the issues: sovereignty and treaty rights, language and cultural rights, fishing and hunting rights, land rights, healthcare and education. There's the kidnap and murder of Native women. There's abusive mismanagement by BIA. Effects of racism on employment, education, health, and survival. So let's see. How can we fight for the self-determination and liberation of Native Americans?
And the program also says our party recognizes that, or says that the genocide of Native peoples must be recognized by honoring treaties, tribal sovereignty, reparations, and affirmative action, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs replacement with a body comprised primarily of Indian nations.
There's also the struggle, like you said, the struggle of Native Hawaiians. U.S. maintains colonies in Guam, Virgin Islands, Samoa. So keep that in mind too, yeah.
Okay, we're going to move forward. We've certainly not resolved everything, but I appreciate everyone contributing to our thoughts at least. When this is all over, maybe we'll get into some serious discussion. Deserves it, I believe. The next part of this, we're going to go back over probably some things we've already mentioned, but considering the group of immigrants in general. Okay, and of course, that is an astonishingly complex group. You can almost make no generalizations about it, but here we go. Do our best here. We, a lot of people, a lot of the right wingers even are they're very proud to say that this is a nation of immigrants, right? And then they turn right around and exploit the hell out of the most recent ones to arrive. And that's certainly been the pattern all along. And of course, African Americans or Africans originally were probably the most exploited and remain so through here. But when we're talking about exploitation and the need to develop unity among the working class, now we need to start kind of taking these very vague ideas and making them more concrete. And hopefully our program helps us do that to some extent. Immigrants, as a rule, have at least one, the most recently arrived immigrants have really felt the brunt of the police state. The undocumented immigrants are, of course, always at risk of being deported. Even the documented ones are going to be, threatened and inconvenienced and fired or whatever, kind of at the drop of a hat. They are also very convenient targets of scapegoating. Of course, as we know, that's a feature of most fascism. And immigrants are, Trump accused them of bringing disease in. Now they're being accused of bringing fentanyl in and all this other stuff. They're causing the drug problem. They're causing the opiate problem. The immigrants, as a rule, they attack American values. You heard that one, right? Just their very presence and the very fact of being, of honoring their own traditions and customs puts us at risk, right? That's a great one. Illegal voting. They work their way through the gauntlet of cartels all the way up through Mexico so they could vote illegally. That's why they, Greg Abbott just really hates it when they do that, But again, false stories, they're relatively voiceless. Again, certainly as recent arrivals, they tend to have very little platform, very little access to public pronouncements. And just for their own practical safety, they tend to want to be quiet and go under the radar. So they're an easy target. The immigrants. Now, interestingly, nobody. The program says the right wing, but I would say the establishment, the duopoly, the neoliberal Democrats and the right-wing Republicans neither want immigration reform because, once again, we have a great ready-made underclass right here. We talk about that particularly in the case of Mexicanos and well, to some extent Mexican Americans, but that really applies even more generally, right? So they like to point to everyone's desperate attempt to get into the United States as a validation of this great, city on the hill. At the same time that they refuse to acknowledge that outrageous, horrid, economic treaties such as CAFTA, literally drove thousands, if not millions, of subsistence farmers off their land up here. You know, I mean, it's just bizarre what's going on, but they love it. They love it, and they're not about to fix it anytime soon, without a lot of pressure from us, their allies, and others. Anyway, it's a weird paradox, but you know, we just need to be aware of that. Can we go to the next one?
Before we proceed to the
Yeah,
next
yeah.
slide, there's one thing I'd like to clarify that I think very much. So a lot of, I hear a lot of people who are nominally pro-working class discuss this idea of, well, does immigration really strengthen the position of the working class? Should working class advocates support immigration when it dilutes the labor pool? It does this and this and this. And look, here's the thing that's important to understand. Control of quote unquote immigration policy necessarily means you have control over the state machinery that enforces it. And if you have the control over that state machinery, then you don't need to restrict immigration to strengthen the position of the working class. You can do significantly more radical things with that state machinery that will have significantly more beneficial effects to the strength of the working class. So the idea of a pro-working class restrictive immigration policy is a complete contradiction in terms, because there is no situation in which that would be both possible and desirable.
Yeah. And I'm glad you made that. I overlooked the very first point. Labor has undergone a fundamental transformation on that very question. You know, up until about 1980, U.S. labor was really quite bigoted, quite anti-immigrant. They did see immigrant labor as a way of cutting the wage and threatening jobs and all this other stuff. Finally, in 1980, which is when we got rid of AFLID, when we got rid of Lane Kirkland, some of the major changes in labor occurred. A substantial number of the international unions actually marched against U.S. intervention in El Salvador and other places. They took a very proactive stand in favor of humane U.S. policy and in favor of immigrant workers here in this country as well. So that has made a big difference. And I'm glad to say that it seems to continue. We have another group we really haven't mentioned a great deal, but Muslims and Middle Eastern people, they came to the fore, of course, in 9/11. George Bush tried to ameliorate it, I guess, sort of weirdly. But after 9/11, Muslims and even Sikhs, you know, people who were apparently Muslim, or Latinos, you know, who might have looked Middle Eastern, were the targets of great abuse and fear and what have you. Again, it's a type of exploitation. It is a type of weakness imposed on these groups. And let's be clear, Muslims are by no means homogeneous. It's incredibly complex. Very millions and billions of people are Muslim from all over the world. But just for a quick review, demonization of Arabs, South Asians, and Muslims from other parts of Central Europe, you know, Central Asia, I guess you'd say, Central Asia, South Asia. It has provided the rationale for military adventures. You know, I mean, Afghanistan, I think, is a real good example. And they have been trotted out, you know, those terrible Muslims, those dangerous Muslims, wherever, not letting girls go to school. By golly, let's go send in the Marines. You know, that has been a constant theme for 20 some years, right? And seems to be a pretty steady element right now. Let's go to the next one.
I would say also, I didn't put a picture, but in Houston, I know that the Islamic Association of North America has an annual conference. I know people from Houston there are familiar with it. And I don't know if it's still happening, but I mean, there was a moment there where we were seeing these fascist right militias, like, or I don't call it really militias. It's more like a group of guys with trying to intimidate people showing up. But I remember seeing pictures of it and seeing communists and socialists and so on, like standing with people attending this conference and people in their local community. And I think, yeah, and I think that took a lot of courage to do. And
Next up is Asians and Asian Americans. Again, a vast territory of the earth. Asia is the largest inhabited continent, I guess you'd say. And so you have a lot of folks from different parts. They have different religions, of course, different ethnicities, different cultures, etc. But they tend to get lumped together conveniently now with our government's demonization of the Chinese. And of course, this was the first time Chinese have been demonized. There's a red peril, the yellow peril, sorry, not the red, the yellow peril back before the turn of the century, and then later on, they were worried that those Chinese were breeding like rabbits and would soon overwhelm us good white folk. And so there were terrible draconian laws that were put in place specifically against Chinese. But these days, anybody from Asia tends to get lumped in. And so we should exercise, again, as good communists, our understanding and our solidarity with these folks as best we can. Some came as a result of military action on the part of the United States, Vietnamese, South Koreans, such as that. Others have come for purposes of just economic improvement. Sometimes there's kind of a mix.
And I would make a note about Houston again. I was reading about in the 1980s, there were Vietnamese immigrants that had been settling in Houston, and it's a complicated issue because if as communists, to relate with people that left Vietnam at that time, but were then suddenly attacked by the Ku Klux Klan in that area, and yeah, I'm not that familiar with, but shrimpers, yeah,
Fishermen, yeah.
And on the some of the pictures, I think on the left was actually demonstrations against the Vietnam War by Asian Americans, and I think on the left in California, and in the center is Filipino Americans, Filipinos. So you see also the expansion of military bases. There's military bases in the Philippines that's underway right now. Yeah, and so there's this Filipino democratic struggle. It's often youth-driven, democratic people struggles, both in the Philippines and also by Filipino in this country. That has been ongoing for a long time, and like an anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggle. So different countries have their own particular histories, particular characteristics that we have to understand. We also see how anti-Asian racism also has commonality. It's like the target as a whole people.
This next section, last but not least, I would say, the struggle for full equality for women. And this, of course, intersects with quite a number of other struggles. It was kind of the original, if you would, intersectional struggle from long ago. And it's had several different ways, feminism per se. But let's look at just some basic facts here. As racism is, so is misogyny, male supremacy, gender inequality. This is also a very potent weapon for dividing the working class. 50-50, right? And it's outrageous that even now, 50% of the workers are getting like 70-80% of what the other half is getting in terms of wages. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's just absurd. And the only difference is the gender. So we've got a lot of work to do on that score. Sexism causes working class women to suffer additional forms of oppression and exploitation. Now, interestingly, if you go to Cuba, one of the first things they did in Cuba was offer wonderful childcare facilities free of charge to all families. to all women. And they basically, to this day, tell the women that, okay, if you give birth to a child, you can get a year off paid to stay with your child, bond, and do all the mommy things with your child. If you're a professional and you want to get back to work, here's a early child care facility that is staffed with college graduates or associates, at least 2 years of college in child development, who will be working in about a 5-to-1 ratio with your child all day. And you can come and visit during your lunch hour if you want to do that, blah, blah, blah. Now think about that. It's not just because the Cubans were being nice. They wanted full participation of everyone in the task of building socialism in Cuba. And you cannot do that if you don't make those kinds of adjustments, right? And so this sexism where, you know, we expect a woman to go to work for 8 hours and then, you know, make dinner and, you know, maybe run a few loads through the washer and, you know, oh, you like that ironed, do you, dear? You know, that sort of craziness. That's got to go, folks. And I think as communists, we could certainly make some adjustments in our own domestic situation there. Would probably be appreciated. I know it is in mine. I'm still not up to speed here, but I'm painfully aware of how far short we've fallen. And we need, there are things that we can do at a personal level to build toward that. Your own personal efforts aren't going to make everything better, but it's at least a good way to get your head in the game.
We're going to talk a little bit about youth and students and a few other subjects. So actually probably be easier for me to stand during this. You know, you probably read a lot of articles about how today's youth are more open to the concept of socialism than any time in probably several, you know, some years. It's not unprecedented in American history. The program states that the youth have the potential to serve as a key link between the overall youth and the working class in light of unprecedented challenges, including 3 things in specific, but there's more than that. Capitalist exploitation, class stratification, climate change. There's inequality, what we're talking about, so the threat of climate change, but also just the, you know, I mean, everything probably a lot of people here experience, right? Which is, you know, indebtedness, the great economic uncertainty, right? You can be fired for any reason, Phil's Texas, from your job. And me and Albert were talking earlier, it's like what if someone loses their job, you know, something you do, that's when we talk about the working class defending their rights, defending themselves from attack, like losing your job, being fired, that can be a traumatic experience for people. It could be a death sentence for people. Where that's done on mass scale, right? Here in Texas, especially, but all, you know, in the United States, but here in Texas, especially, it's no wonder why we see, you know, half of people under the age of 40. It's not even, used to say maybe just 20, you know, people 20. Now it's under 40 that are open socialists. So you see, you see the some of the underlying economic material reasons why that is, but also like you think of the subjective reasons, like changes in education and consciousness among people.
Yeah, so there's a stereotype, a pervasive stereotype in American culture that you become more conservative as you age. That you hear this a lot. I think it would be more accurate to say that you become more conservative as you acquire capital and investment in the capitalist system, which traditionally associated with aging, but that connection has been increasingly broken as opportunities to advance yourself in the capitalist system have been withdrawing, as capitalism itself has been contracting and finding more opportunities to squeeze profit out of the last little bits of drop of blood out of that particular stone. So that as those opportunities close off, that historical trend is slowly starting to deteriorate. I think starting with people who are in their 30s now, but it'll likely only get stronger with time.
We also see efforts to criminalize youth via militarized approaches and also mobilize youth to support the extreme right, especially on college campuses and the military. It's a lot of money spent on right-wing student groups. At universities, full-time organizers, they're paid to do it, and in the military, you know, and so forth. So, let's see here. There's also the LGBTQ community. The program states that the extreme right uses, I've added some of my own views on it. It says that transphobia in particular, we've seen as wedges to split the working class and people's movements. The ability of the extreme right to take advantage of transphobia, homophobia depends entirely on hesitance within the working class towards sexual minorities. The working class is united in opposing this. Like transphobia would be shattered. Like it's you know, because a lot of this money is coming from also this pushing this is coming from capital. Like we talked about, what's the Manhattan Institute, Rufo, the guy?
Christopher Rufo.
He's a DeSantis guy, right?
He's sort of a Republican political strategist who is a large portion of masterminding on the DeSantis campaign, the overarching strategy of the Republican Party.
Yeah, and you know, I look at the Wall Street Journal.
Well, he's moved from CRT to woke as his buzzword of choice, which ultimately means the same thing.
One other section of this, a part of the program is farmers and rural population. Says that all working people are affected by crisis in rural America. Farmers, farm workers, farm processing workers receive a shrinking share as much of rural wealth flows to large agribusiness giants. So Monsanto, Cargill, Tyson, etc. The dispatching of worker-farmer alliances built in the 1930s contributed to the seizure of power by the extreme right. So this is a big deal in the 30s. We didn't get to talk about that period that much in this, but like the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party, Worker-Farmer Alliance, Hammer-Sickle, like forces that built the New Deal and so on. The Communist Party supports, supports legislation to ensure fair commodity prices, restitution for Black farmers. Like the example is discrimination in farm loans. There is, white farmers benefited from essentially free land grant colleges, teach people how to farm, and low interest loans to upgrade mechanized farm equipment. It's not as Black farmers. Also, the party says stop developers from gobbling up farmland, demand union wages for farm workers, among other demands. So, talk about the youth, talk about seniors, because seniors and retirees are under regular attack by right-wing efforts to privatize Social Security, Medicare. Some of the gains won in the 30s. In Texas, in over-reliance, this is in the program, but I said, well, this sounds a lot like Texas. This is over-reliance on aggressive property and sales taxes. Have a disproportionate impact on seniors living on fixed incomes. Assisted care facilities shamelessly exploit workers, cut corners in care. Some aspects of our culture also devalue seniors. And I always sometimes think about that when people say, talk about boomers, that kind of thing. It's devalue, that kind of generational thing. So that is in replicating our own needs, rather than trying to build that unity between labor, between seniors fighting for their economic rights, between the youth as a key link, between the overall youth and the workers movement and so forth. High rates of voting, they say, give seniors a lot of political muscle. However, in alliance labor movement, progressive forces, seniors can defeat these attacks. Jewish community, in the 19th and 20th century, Jewish community contributes substantially to the working class movement fight for socialism in the United States. They actually illustrate that these are garment workers from the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, early 20th century. Many of these workers were Jewish, Italian, immigrant women. And in the upper left, you can't really read it, but that's like the Daily Worker building, I think, in New York in the 30s. And next to it is a sign for the Jewish Daily Freiheit, freedom. And that was, I think, at a time when the 20s had a higher circulation of the worker. So it was a Yiddish language communist newspaper. So and these are immigrants who were often working in these large, textile factories in New York and so forth. Jewish community vote heavily against the extreme right, 70%, against the Republicans. The Jewish community has strong progressive traditions, and that is a contradiction that we've seen since Israel. The Israeli state has increasingly aligned itself with the extreme right in the United States, the Republicans, which has created it's a complicated issue, a lot going on, but has alienated progressive American Jews. You're seeing a develop. Yes, Mary? Yes. But yeah, anti-Semitism serves as an instrument of reaction, reaching a new extreme under the Trump administration. When the rightist danger gets stronger, so does anti-Semitism, and we're seeing that. Social movements for progress. There's a wide spectrum of organizations and movements in our country that play an important role in political life. Peace groups, environmental organizations, civil liberties organizations, independent media, and so on. This is a section of the program that I read this as sort of, we're like leaving this. it's creating space for us to be creative and flexible. So there's a wide variety. It doesn't list everything. And it's like probably back in the day, it would have been independent radio, the progressive radio, like in Houston. How are you going to, because there probably wasn't going to be any corporate. So it's just, I think this is a way, I think, this is my take on it, but I think this is a way that when they were creating the program we can like then fold in kind of a lot of different like environmental movements and so on that can then take on like large scale movement or merge in with other movements. So I like this part because these are just things I like, but I think kind of progressive. So, but talk about progressive culture. There's a section on that. It says artists struggle to create art that involves the working class of all people. Obstacles include lack of funding, commercialism, lack of encouragement for art that challenges capitalist culture, so on, commodification, so restriction of some forms of art to the wealthy under my democratic participation. Entertainment industry focuses on short-term profits, distorting education culture, exploits artists, impoverishes cultural forms available to people. Corporate sponsorship tends to restrict anti-corporate content. That's not surprising. Many forms of artistic expression of humanistic democratic content. Now, thought this was interesting. It's in the program, and it's true, I think. It's including commercial art form. It's not like we're communists. We're like, oh, I'm not going to watch Star Trek or Ozarks or whatever. I included that because, I mean, that's an example, right? Because it is like a show with a lot of humanistic, like socialist content. I mean, yeah. But there's a tension there. You know, there's a tension. I mean, I'm like a fan of the show, but like, there's a tension between there's the pressure to kind of, well, we have to have more, explosions or something this season in order to get the ratings up because, and
Realize explosions.
I do too, but I mean, like I watch it, but but there's always this tension even in commercial art forms between what the creators are trying to do and what the whatever the shareholders of the company that owns the production company is.
If I may add something on that, there's a famous quote from George Lucas where he argued that he had less creative freedom than the average Soviet filmmaker. And keep in mind, he was saying this at the height. He was saying this at the height of the Cold War.
Yes.
And he said that basically he's like, look, I am hemmed in on all sides by what the studio wants. I have my creative freedom is basically nothing. The studio dictates with an extremely high level of specificity what I am and am not allowed to do. And it's not because some government bureaucrat is coming down and stamping censored on my face. It's because the market demands more explosions.
Well, I was going to add on this. Developing a vibrant people's culture with working class culture at its core and appreciation for the cultural expressions of all peoples is an essential part of building mass struggle against the system. Public funding can also deepen education about the artistic contributions of all peoples in this country. And so the examples of this in the images, I don't know if you can't see them well, but that's a mural at a labor hall. I believe it was moved, but I think in Ohio, Michigan, somewhere. So I mean, working class art can also include art that's being produced during for a picket line, and it can be, or I mean, it's not this is not a narrow subject at all in terms of art. But Paul Robeson, actually, I picked Mary J. Blige because I mean she's a commercial artist, right? But like enormously influential artist in our history. It's not like communists are like removed from the culture. Like we have our own kind of culture too, We have our own subculture kind of in some ways, an international left culture, right? But it's not like we're like not taking part in culture or like participating in this as well. And so it's going to have it's not a black or white thing. It's a complex culture. And talking about public funding, Carl Sagan, right? Cosmos or Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Sesame Street, these beloved things. What channel is that on?
PBS.
Public Broadcasting.
And even on other subjects, a lot of the golden age British rock bands were born out of public state funding for musical education that was accessible to working class people in Britain in the 50s and 60s, and really up until, surprise, surprise, up until Maggie Thatcher. But you always see efforts by the right to cut as much public funding as every time we do it. At least right. What Trump had to do it. I don't know what the status is. Healthcare struggles are almost done. This is something we're all dealing with. Capitalism aversion to ensuring healthcare for its working people most is something we're all familiar with. The U.S. spends more on healthcare than any other country. It's a big business, yet experiences poor outcomes for countries where healthcare is recognized as a right.
We don't have to compare to, even advanced capitals, developed capitalist countries in Europe, but Cuba, for example, higher life expectancy in the United States, I think significantly. Where you go in, there's 3 doctors waiting to see you. 3. And yeah, things that are, like when we look at Cuba, I mean, I haven't been there, talked to, people, I know people have been there. They say, there are some things that are hard there, it's not like utopia, right? But there's some things that are easy there that are feel like instrumental obstacles in this country, like housing and healthcare. And so, I don't know about ACA, but we'll say communist support, comprehensive, free, guaranteed access to quality care, a socialized healthcare system, socialized medicine is achieved. The party calls for protecting, say, Medicare, expanding what's been built on, implementing Medicare for all. Women fully in control of reproductive health and family planning.
There's also worth discussing is the knock-on effects of the privatization of health insurance, where people are compelled to keep working in a job that they despise because they are unwilling or unable to take the risk of a lapse of medical insurance that is provided to them by their job. It's another chain that connects them to capitalism.
Yeah, I would like to offer a very quick critique of this part of the program. I think it's just it's fundamentally ridiculous to say that we support privatized health insurance and its expansion, the ACA, and Medicare for all. It's bizarre, it's ridiculous, we need to clean that up.
Yeah.
The ACA was a Republican plan, let's remember, that Obama chose over Medicare for all. And I don't think our party should be on the record as supporting the damn thing. It's a giveaway to damn insurance companies. Most people can't even afford it. So hopefully we can adjust that at our next one.
Glad we talked about it. This is the last part of section 3, progressive and democratic religious movements. There's many organized religions have within them segments of progressive and democratic religious activists, long traditions, progressive activism, certainly true in this country. And religion is also a complicated subject. There's different tendencies, different movements within it. It can take different class, has different class character of movements. They speak in a religious language. Liberation theology in Latin America is a notable example. I don't know a lot about it. Maybe others have read about it, just been talking to me about it, but that's a big thing. And so some religious organizations ally themselves with democratic movements, labor movement, peace and justice movements, anti-capitalist globalization movements. That's true. This picture actually is from, this is from Charlottesville. I don't think it was on that year. There was a flash there, like the Nazi rally. It's on the street where there was a car attack. I think they might be marching in the memorial of it. These are progressive ministers. So that's the end of our presentation. That's all we've got.